Future Hindsight. How is gerontocracy distorting our democracy? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. When I think about demographic changes in America, I primarily think of how the racial diversity of the population has grown and continues to grow. And if you're a loyal listener to the podcast, you'll know that we often have discussions about achieving a multiracial democracy that works for all. But in those conversations, we're not really talking a lot about the fact that 10,000 people turn 65 each day in the United States. It is, of course, evident to all of us that we have many elected representatives across the country who are elderly, and it turns out that's just a symptom. To explore how gerontocracy distorts our democracy, we're joined by Samuel Moyn. He's the Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University, the co-host of the Digging a Hole podcast, and the author of several books, including Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. His latest book is Gerontocracy in America, How the Old Are Hoarding Power and Wealth, and What to Do About It. Welcome, Sam. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So to make sure we're all on the same page before we dig in, how do you define gerontocracy, and why is it specifically a democratic problem and not just a generational one?
Well, gerontocracy refers to the empowerment of the elderly and the rule by, of, and for older people. Democracy is rule of, by, and for the people. So when older people take over, the people as a whole are ousted, and democracy is replaced by something else, a kind of form of oligarchy that is about age preference.
Yeah, I like the way that you so succinctly defined that. So I want to go into more detail on how gerontocracy works in practice and how we're experiencing it in our everyday lives. But I want to foreshadow some of the genuinely radical solutions that you propose to gerontocracy. For example, abolishing the Senate, youth quotas, pension reform, campaign finance reform. But what does a democracy that has broken free from the grip of gerontocracy look like? And who does it serve better?
Well, I think it should serve everyone, and we should treat everyone equally. That's the kind of ground principle of democracy. But we're not doing that in America today, and that's largely for the reasons we'll get into, that we live in an aging society. And what it would look like to have a more genuine #democracy is giving more representation to younger people than we've achieved, and giving more voting power to younger people than we have right now. And it's true, I have some radical solutions, but I have some modest ones too. And I'll give you like a gateway drug to start, and then we could get into some bigger solutions down the road if people accept them.
So, well, one of the proposals is youth quotas,
Yes.
As opposed to age limits that cap how old someone can be to serve, right? And that seems a little bit counterintuitive at first listen, but it does guarantee seats for younger people. Tell us why you like quotas better than caps, or actually the way that you said it, you want both caps and quotas. But how would that work in practice?
Well, just as a background, the list of solutions I'm offering kind of depends on the problem. So if we start with a big problem that, as you said, Americans now accept is very real, which is the age of our politicians. And one issue there is that older people can experience cognitive decline, especially as they get really old, as Joe Biden did, as Donald Trump is doing. And an age limit is really effective because it says we shouldn't have folks in office who are at risk of that syndrome that we've all lived through. The trouble with an age limit, though, is that if we just say people over a certain age can't serve, then the great likelihood is that most of the politicians will be just below that age. And what we really want to do is not just guard against the risk of cognitive decline, but also think about how we make our representation more representative. So if you look at Congress today, it's pretty shocking. I think there's only one person in Congress of all the 435 Congress people and the 100 senators who's in his 30s, and then very few in their 40s. So we're talking about a really kind of elderly group of people, regardless of whether they're high functioning or not. And when we say, especially with respect to gender and race, that we want a group of politicians that look like America, well, we're worst off when it comes to the age of our politicians. And so youth quotas would basically say they work in different ways around the world, but we need representation for all the different age cohorts. And you'd guarantee seats for people in their 30s, 40s, not just those in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Right. Well, your book is deeply researched, and I was really shocked by the imbalance of how many, quote, old people are in the United States overall, as a percentage of the overall population. But then, of course, in politics, that's even more intense. So I want to jump to what I consider the most radical proposal, which is to abolish the Senate. You argue that the Senate is a gerontocratic chokehold on the democratic process. So I think this is not maybe obvious to most people. How does the Senate specifically function as an instrument of gerontocracy? And how would we go about abolishing it?
Great question. Just as background, most of humanity has lived under gerontocracy, and it used to be quite open. Like most people around the world, for most time, have had councils of elders rule them. And of course, there were kings, and there could be even young kings. But before that, and alongside monarchy, there were systems of gerontocracy. And when our founders met in 1787 to draft the Constitution, they decided to reboot gerontocracy in various ways. One way was through saying in the Constitution that you had to be a certain age to serve for federal office. And that excluded a gargantuan percentage of the people alive in 1787. Like the 35-year-old age minimum for president excluded upwards of 70%. But then they did something else, which was very literally to create an American Council of Elders. And of course, it's called the Senate, which is named after old men. So we have a branch of government that's named after old people. And that was intentional. There were very few senates in the world at the time, like one or two. And now there are a lot on the American model because the American founders wanted to get older people in office on principle. Now, the Senate has played a pretty baleful role in the couple centuries since. And the astonishing thing is that it seems impossible to abolish on paper because Article 5 of the Constitution, which talks about how it can be amended, actually says you can't get rid of the Senate. It's like the one thing you can't change about American democracy, so-called. So like gerontocracy is hardwired in to our culture, but I think it can change. And one thing we could do is just say, well, all the cool stuff the Senate gets to do, because it has special powers, is just going to be reassigned. And we're not going to abolish the thing. Maybe we keep the old guys around, old women too in our day, for a kind of consultative role. But like all the other ways of confronting gerontocracy, we would be saying we shouldn't let age be correlated with power anymore. Maybe if you think older people are wise or older people's bodies, like the Senate, are wise, they can consult, they can give advice, but they can't tell us what to do. And so we could kind of make an end run around that provision in the Constitution, and it would be pretty easy if there were political will.
Yeah, that's always the question, political will. So sticking with politicians serving, you also discuss campaign finance reform as a solution for getting younger people to serve in office. And again, I think this is not maybe super obvious in a way that age limits are. So what's like the 60-second crash course on why money in politics specifically advantages older Americans?
Well, as everyone knows, we have a pretty private way of funding elections, and that's so out of step with global democracy. So on a podcast about saving democracy, I think the biggest thing we have to do is move to public funding, which means the government organizes the funding of elections on fair terms. Having a privatized system, especially in the age of Citizens United, means that you are out looking for funders if you want to run. And that privileges older people because, as we can discuss more later, it's astonishing how disproportionate the control of wealth is by older Americans compared to everyone else. And so it's natural that then those who are funding campaigns are going to be relatively older. And the data is pretty stunning. In some elections, the donors on average are in their 60s or even 70s, and some of the most famous donors like Donald Trump's, one of his lead donors named Timothy Mellon was up there. So I think there's an easy fix for that one. If we decided to do something about campaign finance, about Citizens United, about the equation of money and speech, and above all, about our big mistake in this country, which was to let private individuals be the funders of elections.
Right, right. Well, notably, New York City has a new young mayor in large part because there is public matching dollars,
Absolutely.
8-1 in New York. And I think a lot of people don't know that. It made it possible for a young person to run.
Absolutely. And it is possible because we have some kind of democracy for ordinary people, small donors, to circumvent our system. And that was famously the case even in producing a then not as old candidacy of Bernie Sanders in 2016. But I mean, now he's pushing it. But we know we can publicly fund election through, in a sense, a huge number of private donors. That's closer to something that's more democratic, but it's rare. And most elections end up being controlled by older people. And that's why my main message is actually, let's get beyond politicians, because it may not matter how much the politicians are if they're serving old money.
Well, let's turn to the voters, because another idea, of course, is to lower the voting age, which I've seen. And I know some local elections already do that in the United States.
Yes.
An idea that you mentioned in the book, which was new to me, is proxy voting. And then there's another idea to disenfranchise older voters. How would these kinds of voting reforms redistribute democratic power?
Well, let's start with even more modest solutions, which are available globally. I mean, one is obviously mandatory voting, which some countries have, and how they work depends on the penalty, and that would end some of the disproportionately older voting patterns we see. We could have fewer elections because the story of gerontocracy is that the more elections you have, then you'll have older people dominating the less interesting elections, especially like off-cycle elections, primaries. So we could just actually have fewer elections. We could stop penalizing mobility, which we do through forms of registration that effectively benefit older people who stay in one place. But then we get into the edgier solutions, which you mentioned. Proxy voting is the idea that there are folks who are unrepresented who some other people can represent by proxy. And this is best known through the idea that parents should get extra votes for their children, something that J.D. Vance has actually championed. But my proposal is that disenfranchised children should be represented by the youngest eligible voters. So like the older brother or sister would get the vote of their younger brother or sister on the grounds that the parents have their own interests, especially in like family policies, whereas children may need to be represented by fellow young people. Then, as you mentioned, we could also lower the voting age. And it is amazing that in California, Maryland, some other places, there are successful movements just for urban elections like mayor and dog catcher to have 16-year-olds vote. Then you get to the edgiest proposal, which I wouldn't call disenfranchising older people, because you can actually achieve the same result by just inflating the weight of the younger people's vote. And here's the basic idea. We have the idea in the United States of one person, one vote, which was really crucial in the civil rights movement to get fair representation. But when you think about it, we might want to say that what really matters is how many life years you have ahead of you. Why should older people be voting for a future which they won't see when they've had all those chances to vote before? And the idea would basically be to assign more weight to your vote the younger you are. And so, in a sense, not to give up on equality or one person, one vote, but to reinterpret it. So it's not about whether you have a body, but in a sense, how old that body is and how long it can expect to live. And then we're really saying that your vote should be about how much stake you have in the election. And younger people expecting to be alive much longer can say that they have a bigger stake.
Well, I think it would hopefully also incentivize young people to vote because, of course, as we know in this country, old people vote in high numbers.
Yes.
And, of course, as a consequence, it's not a surprise that they elect old representatives and that those representatives serve their interests. And in a way, one could argue that this is democracy working as designed. The people who vote in the people who represent them.
Yes.
So in what ways is gerontocracy in this instance failing democracy?
Well, I'm sympathetic to the view that we should, troll young people and get them to turn out. But I'm also taken by the view that young people often see democracy as a gerontocratic conspiracy that doesn't give them an in. And so if we're interested in why young people are so alienated from so-called democracy, it's because they see so clearly that it's been designed to thwart them and their interests. And so I just wondered if we should, in a sense, not just shame younger people, but start to shame a system that leads them to feel so unrepresented. Let me try another edgy analogy. It turns out that if you're white in America, you're much likelier to vote than if you're not. But we would never say, or at least I wouldn't, that non-white, non-voters are just lazy. Rather, we have something called white supremacy, and it does haunt American democracy. And we have adopted techniques to face it down in history. Just as an example, the Supreme Court basically just ditched them, but we invented majority-minority districts, which would allow African Americans to feel represented by being able to elect Black politicians. And there's no reason we shouldn't adopt the same view about age and youth, that when you have a pattern of folks not voting, some of it you can ascribe to laziness in the case of youth who have other things to do than show up at umpteen elections. But I think it's also a syndrome, call it elder supremacy. And it should be just as radioactive to us as white supremacy, if not more.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I like it. Well, one thing that I never thought about, and you explain so well in the book, is how gerontocracy supercharges economic inequality and how that creates a feedback loop to capture our politics. And I think it would be so helpful for listeners to understand how this works. Could you explain it for us, please?
Absolutely. So it's hard because it's reasonable to think that the longer you're alive, the more you can justifiably accumulate. So we should expect older people to be richer than younger people. But it's gotten much worse over the past 40 years. And the class inequality that we sometimes complain about, the 1% and so forth, is very strongly age correlated. And I provide all the receipts in the book and associated articles, but the numbers are flabbergasting.
Yes.
About how different it is now than in the past and just how extreme it's become. And of course, that has implications, as we discussed, for who can fund elections, who can show up at elections because they have power at work or they've retired in circumstances that allow them to show up, whereas others are hostage at their jobs. On this topic, I think we also have to widen the aperture, because it's not just how much money you have, but the forms of wealth. So I mentioned jobs. In the old days, there was mandatory retirement in the United States, but that was abolished. And that means that while a lot of older people work because they have to, like they're living hand to mouth, like a lot of other poor people or people of limited means, a lot of gerontocrats work because they want to. And that means they're drawing Social Security, and they can get all the elder benefits that were designed for retirees, but they're also drawing the highest salaries at work, and they're not leaving. And that's true of CEOs, it's true of professors, it's true across a lot of sectors, which we should revisit. And then there's housing, which is a form of wealth. And the story there is that, of course, people, worked really hard to buy their homes. But as they age, they're the only people who show up at the local town meetings where we, for whatever insane reason in this country, make zoning decisions. And they block new builds. And so if there's a crisis of housing supply, it's in part because folks want to control their environment once they have a house. Even when the proposals are to build elder-appropriate housing, it's blocked by older citizens in these town meetings. And of course, folks we're talking about tend to stay in their house indefinitely. And so the stats there are maybe the most extraordinary thing I found in the book, which is basically the average age of first home purchase has been trending up and up by decades. And home ownership is really a gray and white-haired phenomenon at this time because there's no supply, because the builds are blocked, and then the folks who bought their houses years ago stay in them, in part because they get a lot of tax breaks for being old. And so that's a form of wealth that is enormously important too. And it's a story that is maybe the most graphic one about gerontocracy in this domain.
Yeah, it's really, I think when I was reading your book, I just thought, it's right under our noses, and we just don't even think about it. We just accept it as a given, and we don't think that this is a problem, first of all, and then let alone having to solve it. The most obvious quote problem is that we see that there are old people serving in Congress, right? We are like, oh my God, why are they so old? And we don't think about what is causing that. And you say in the book that old people serving as elected representatives are just a symptom. What's actually the disease?
Well, it's a great question. I think that, symptoms are very important too, and we should deal with our symptoms. If I have a headache, I take a pill regardless of what's causing it. Mm-hmm. And I even think the syndrome of elder politicians has flown under the radar. It's just that we're suffering from, Joe Biden's candidacy, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg bet on her longevity. But given how old school gerontocracy is in human affairs, I think we've kind of leaned into that and tolerated it for too long and should reckon with it. But of course, there is a disease. And I think ultimately it's the elder control of the political system, just directly through controlling elections, but also indirectly through funding them and having the wealth to get politicians, no matter their age, to serve their interests. And I think the reason we tolerate it is that it's actually a side effect of something amazing, which is that we live longer. I talk a lot about this in the book, but I want to live as long as the doctors can allow it. And grandparents are great. And maybe elders have a place because they have accumulated experience, although maybe they're just repeating old mistakes. This is not a book about hostility to older people. Actually, it proposes that we should actually take better care of them in our so-called welfare state. A democracy needs a welfare state. But I think the reason the disease has been missed is because it's kind of a side effect of a good thing, which is life extension, which essentially everyone wants.
Yeah. Well, you talk about aging, and I feel like a conversation about gerontocracy would not be complete without talking about Social Security and Medicare.
Yes.
And you dedicate a number of chapters to this conundrum that we have, with the way that we're funding these programs. So what are we getting wrong about entitlements, and how is the socialist way of aging the answer?
Well, the reason I had to lean into this topic, just for your listeners' background, is that the folks who, like me, have made arguments about intergenerational unfairness before have mostly made them because they wanted to get rid of the welfare state. And they said it's just so expensive, and older people are getting the lion's share of benefits, which at the federal level, they certainly are, like 6 to 7 federal dollars for every one that a child gets. And I thought long and hard about that. But the real issue is that the age of gerontocracy is the age of tax revolts, including to protect that precious housing and wealth that you've accumulated over time. And we know that older people, not everyone, but as a general rule, are very protective of their stuff. And so that's reasonable, I think, in part because our welfare state turns out to be not generous enough. Medicare, which is the program for healthcare that came from the 1960s, excludes long-term care. It's just for when you're sick, which aging has not been defined as an illness. And so in America, we've had this revolution where you're likely to live a very long time, almost everyone. Not even the good die young anymore. And a lot of bad people live a very long time. And they don't know when they're going to die. And they're very fearful, reasonably, because who's going to take care of them? The state won't. And so they have a rationale or rationalization for hoarding, if you want to use a kind of confrontational term. And so my proposal is almost like the opposite of what's been made before. Intergenerational justice requires us to be more caring towards older people, and then say you shouldn't hoard, you shouldn't have that much power and housing and wealth and jobs if other people aren't getting it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about hoarding. That's the subtitle of your book, that the old are hoarding power and wealth. And you talked a lot already about how they do that through public policy, like tax revolt and accumulating housing stock. But talk a little bit more about how the gerontocracy consolidates and protects its grip both on power and wealth through institutions and through something called the AARP?
So, my general POV in the book is that as we age, we become more conservative with a small c. Of course, there are a lot of right-wing young people, and the boomers, at least in their youth, were notoriously left-wing or progressive. But the basic idea is that we age, we become more into the repetition of what we know. The familiar is our policy. And when it comes to material things, we like to keep what we've accumulated and protect it against outsiders, maybe reserving the right to provide means to our children, certainly through educational funding and when private universities are so expensive, but really towards the end of our lives, in part because, as I mentioned, everyone wants to have some power over how they're going to be cared for to the end. But what that means is that older people control so much. And I was inspired to write this book by watching the HBO show Succession, except that I didn't think it was just a show about one old media tycoon and his middle-aged children, but it was about American society. The boomers are dying finally, but their children are in their 50s or 60s. And getting the resources that their parents hoarded, in a sense, too late. And so my question is whether we shouldn't reorient to provide resources to folks when they're being equipped and launched into life, when they're in their primes, and not when they're senior citizens themselves. The AARP is an extraordinary organization because it's one of the best funded lobbies in human history and one of the biggest. People complain about the NRA, but it's tiny in comparison. It's poor in comparison. And the AARP has policies that are really reflective of that elder pension to keep things the way they are. Both of our aged presidents lately, in their 80s by the end, have been visibly nostalgic for the 1950s. And the AARP is kind of came out of that period and, in a sense, keeps America the same. When, in fact, I think what we need to do on a whole host of issues is begin to renovate. When you look at what elder preferences are in politics, it's not to change very much, and especially not to tax people for the government to change very much. Environmental remediation is the best example. The older you are, the less end to facing the climate crisis you are. So there are tremendous issues about what the consequences are going to be, whether we empower people through age individually or through the Senate or through their private org, the AARP.
Well, you mentioned just now that you were inspired to write the book because of the show's Succession. Tell us more how you came to write this book.
Well, it was a perfect storm, really. One big element was my own aging. As a 50-ish academic, I have had to confront my own aging and thinking about, well, why are we here? How should we think about our own aging, our own impending demise and death and decline before it? And in case it wasn't obvious to me that I'm aging, I have 2 college-aged daughters who were always very happy to remind me of just how backwards I am compared to their current views. And they've helped me a lot and inspired a lot of this book. And then I'm at a workplace that is one of the oldest. In academia, famously, we just stopped hiring young people. The jobs evaporated for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that after the abolition of mandatory retirement, the faculties of many universities got older and older. I actually did a little study of my own institution, which is Yale Law School. And for most of the 20th century, the average faculty member was 40-ish. And now it's around 60, and the number of 70s and even 80-year-olds is gargantuan when there were none before. And so gerontocracy is also about the transformation of all of the organizations we're part of, about our workplaces. And so that had a big role too in thinking about the relation between age and politics at this moment.
Yeah, for sure. When I read your book, I thought, yeah, we definitely need to bring back mandatory retirements. Although you also make an example of this with law firms, and there
Yes.
are a number of law firms that mandate retirement at a certain age.
Yes. So there's a law that basically condemns mandatory retirement. It's called the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, but it does provide some exceptions. The best examples are like air traffic control or airline pilot, but it also allows certain business models to contract out of the rules. And so law firms are the best example of those who basically inherited a culture of succession and saying you work up to a certain point, you can be an avuncular counselor, but otherwise you were recruiting new lawyers and not blocking the pipeline. That's actually eroding a bit in our day, but it should be a model for other professions. Now, there are others where we should want older people, if they want to do the work, to engage, like public school teaching is one where it's like all hands on deck because there's a crisis of supply, mainly because it's such a poorly paid and dishonored profession when it should be the reverse, that very few people want to do it. My argument is that when we have a succession issue, we should reckon with it and think about mandatory retirement, but not in every case.
Right. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you have just shared with us into action?
Well, as we've reviewed, I decided to just give a very long laundry list of possible solutions. And then it's like, a box of chocolates. Maybe you won't like everyone, but there might be one you should evangelize and go out and tell your friends. And whether it's, some of the things around age limits and age quotas for politicians, or some of the electoral solutions, or I have a lot in the book about changing our tax code so that we can be fairer to younger people and people in the prime of their life. But more generally, I don't mean this to be a downer, but my main civic spark is for us all to think more than we're usually willing to do about the fact that we're finite, our lives are transient. And that basic act, thinking a little more about why we're here and how long we're here, I think would lead many of us to decide that we have to begin making way for our successors at some point, because we're not meant to be here forever and we're not going to be.
Yeah, that's right. As a personal note, I think people used to talk about that when I was younger.
Absolutely.
They just stopped talking about that. I think
Absolutely.
people talked about this all the time. It was the kind of thing where when people were older, it was like, well, I'm not going to be around, but I think, these are the things that would be good. And now I think people are thinking and talking about how they can continue to look youthful forever. Which is a totally different focus,
Absolutely. I mean, I do a lot in the book with how inveterate it is for people all the way back to seek life extension. It's just that now we succeed, and then there are people who want to succeed beyond our wildest dreams, like Brian Johnson, who's this tech bro who's trying to live forever. And so it's just more plausible that we can extend our lives. Although honestly, it's not clear on average whether we can exceed mid-80s as the average life expectancy without some big, like cellular level revolution in how we can extend life. And so what that means is that we really should keep alive those elements in culture. It used to be religious ones. And of course, religion does still exist in some quarters, that reminded us that we're mortal. And that would be a huge civically valuable thing to reboot, because it would mean that we think of democracy as ultimately a political form for transient human beings. which we are, and I believe we're going to be for the good, for good reason, not just as a tragic fact indefinitely.
Well said. So, looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
Well, I'm inspired every day by my daughters, and I think that while there's a lot of resignation among youth and alienation from the political system, as we discussed before, I also believe that there's a slow rage building, and that in the end, this is the life we have, this is the place and time we're living, and there's no reason why there couldn't be a movement around making our gerontocracy into a democracy. And actually, I think there's prospect for intergenerational collaboration around that project. So again, I'm not hostile to old people. How can I be? And in fact, I see a big role for older people. It's not mainly about getting out of the way. It's about participating in an intergenerational renewal while also making retirement great, which can involve civic tasks that you weren't doing before. And so there's no reason to think about this project in a divisive way. It's about actually the reverse. It's about a new kind of solidarity to avoid the oppression of the younger by the older.
Yeah, here. Thank you very much, Sam, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
Samuel Moyn is the Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University and the author of Gerontocracy in America, How the Old Are Hoarding Power and Wealth and What to Do About It. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Pick one of the possible solutions to the problem of gerontocracy that speaks to you, whether radical or not, and find a way to act on it. But above all else, take the time to think about why we're here, how long we're here, and what that means in the context of our communities and our democracy. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Dr. Katie Gaddini. She's a sociologist, visiting scholar at Stanford University, and the author of Esther's Army, The Christian Women Who Power the American Right. That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Oh, and while you're there, please leave us a review. It really goes a long way to be discovered. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We're here to build your civic action toolkit every week. So follow Future Hindsight now and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Head to youtube.com/Future Hindsight now. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,